Hello, my dear friends. We are back to part 2 of how to read a sewing pattern, and we are using a McCall's costume. I'm making the top, so I figured I would just walk you guys through this entire process. My mom suggested that I teach people more things on social media, and she suggested teaching how to read a pattern because it can be very intimidating, and I do agree with her. I do think that this can be very intimidating if it's your first time ever sewing or first time ever sitting down with a pattern, or if you're leveling up in your pattern sewing skills. So the last video we talked about how to basically read all of the information on the cover of a pattern. And now we're going to talk about what comes inside this packet. Obviously already removed the pattern directions, but basically inside of this pattern packet comes a bunch of directions and a bunch of tissue paper patterns, okay? And let's talk about this. It might be a sensory thing for me, but I absolutely hate the sound and the feel of it. So I always like to cut out my patterns at the largest size and like paste them to grid paper. So I'll have another video up on like how I do that process and why I kind of do that. So we'll talk about that in a minute. But basically inside this packet will come all of the pattern pieces for the size range that you purchased, and also the directions. So let's talk about the directions and how to read them first, and then we'll move on to the pattern and possibly preparing your own pattern. So this is usually how I tell the first page of the directions, because you will be given possibly 2 pieces of paper, back and front. But don't get overwhelmed. Just first find the page that has the style number and the sketch, okay? Then from there, it's going to have directions on how to read the pattern. And we're going to talk about all of this in a second. So as we read through this, we will cover this when we talk about the sewing patterns, but this has your pattern marking guide, and it basically explains to you what each of those things mean. So you have your grain line, which basically is about whether or not your fabric is being cut on the straight grain, if it's being cut parallel to the selvage or the fold. We'll talk about this in a hot minute. The fold line, the buttonhole marking, the button marking, notches and symbols, and basically seam allowance. So this is super important. 5/8 seam allowance is included unless otherwise indicated, but it's not printed on the tissue paper. So that means that this pattern, this sizing includes a 5/8 seam allowance. Again, we will talk about this more when we talk about the patterns. This here is directions on how to adjust this pattern. So if you want to lengthen or shorten, remember I talked about how this is actually the tall pattern. So if I needed to lengthen this because I'm actually a regular, whatever that means, regular height, I would have to shorten from here because it wouldn't really mess up the pattern itself. We'll get to that in a bit. I do think that this is why patterns feel intimidating, because you suddenly jump into all of this jargon that is related to the pattern, that if you don't know how to sew, this can get very overwhelming. But again, we're reading through this together, so don't worry, we will get to all your questions and all those fun things. Now, once we move past directions on how to adjust the pattern, we're going to talk about shrinking our fabric. So, you always want to shrink your fabric before you start cutting and sewing it. It'll talk about circle layouts. It'll talk about the nap. So this is all about your fabric. So let's say that you have a repeat flower pattern or you're using velvet. You just want to be aware of what kind of fabric you're choosing. And then these directions will help you in the placement of your patterns. Okay. And this might also affect how much fabric you're purchasing. You might not be purchasing only 2 yards like we spoke about. You might have to purchase more. And remember when we were looking at the fabric suggestion, like yardage suggestion, and I said sometimes you want to err on the side of more. If you are cutting a velvet or a directional print or a plaid, you do want to accommodate for that. So this portion here is kind of just reminding you to take that into consideration. This little bad boy here, this little star, is basically a suggestion on how to place and cut your fabric. So it's basically saying if you see a pattern number with a star next to it, you're going to cut all of the other pieces first, and then you're going to open the fabric up and you're going to place whatever that pattern piece is and cut it as a single layer, not on a fold, okay, or not on a double. This makes sense when you start to look at the cutting layout directions and you start to see the suggestion here. So we'll talk about that in a bit. Okay, so here it says the pattern may have several cutting lines, which is basically this, because obviously this is a multi-size pattern. So it says select the proper cutting line for the pattern pieces of your size. We will talk about this later when we actually make this together, but I have a little trick. So before cutting all your pieces on the fabric according to your layout, you're going to just pin, or you might chalk line it or something like that. Obviously, this is, the advice, measure twice, cut once, okay? And this here is just a suggestion on how you can mark your fabric. You can thread trace it. You can do it with chalk. You can do it with tracing paper and a dressmaker's wheel. You can, do it with a erasable pen or an erasable marker. So this is sort of a choose your own adventure on how you like to transfer a pattern. You might just want to pin it and cut it. That's up to you. And then the section underneath it is in an alternate language, or maybe this is in your main language and this is the alternate language. So don't get overwhelmed by seeing so much on the page, because not all of it, it's all repetitive information, okay? So now we're going to get to the cutting layouts. And the next thing that we're going to look at is our key here, okay? So this key basically explains these tech pack patterns, or technical design layouts. Clear means it's the right side of the pattern is facing up. When it's dot, it means the wrong side of the pattern is facing up. So that means you've flipped it over. So this is the right side of the pattern facing up, and this is the wrong side, okay? Right side of the fabric, wrong side of the fabric. So we'll get to this because I feel like this is better, easier, like to understand when you see it. But basically, once you do place a pattern on fabric for the first time, you'll understand this a little bit better. So if this doesn't make too much sense to you in your head, don't stress. We will walk through it all together. But here are the diagrams. So if your fabric is 45 inches wide, and it says it's with or without the nap, so if it's velvet or not, and this is the sizes 6 to 12 pattern, you can place all your pattern pieces like this. So that means that right there with the 1, you would place your pattern like this, trace it out, and then for this one here, you would flip it again and then trace it out. So that's sort of how it's directing you. It's giving you suggestions so that way you don't waste fabric. It's very nice of them. And so here we have an example for the jacket. We have for the contrast or the trim or the ruffles, however you want to refer to this mentally for yourself. And then you have the robe and the skirt. So this is a diagram on how you can place your fabric. And then once you've flipped that page over, you will see the directions for your lining and any sort of interfacing that you may need as well. All right, the third video, we will talk about how to follow and understand the sewing directions. And this is where we will start to discuss the language around a sewing pattern. I hope you guys enjoyed. If you have any tips and tricks of your own, please pop them into the comments, and happy sewing.